在过去的几十年里，中国经济取得了前所未有的成就，令全世界瞩目。今天，世界格局正在发生剧烈的变化。中国过去的经济成功所依赖的一些有利条件和环境正面临消解。与此同时，中国自身的改革也进入了深水区，需要解决的难题多，可以借鉴的经验少。面对这些变化和挑战，我们应该如何智慧地应对？能不能通过有效的实践探索，渡过深水区，从而推动中国经济未来的高质量发展？身为一名学者，我同样长期关注和思考这些问题，希望通过经济学的研究，提供实际的有效帮助。今天我请来一位来自美国的老朋友，他的几乎整个职业生涯都在研究中国经济。我们将从经济学的角度，对中国经济当前的一些话题进行共同的探讨和思考。Hi, Nick. Welcome back to China. Trump has won the election, and Trump launched many current policies. It's going to have almost a revolution, not just for American economy, but probably also for the world economy. So let's just start from there. What's your take on the impacts that Trump's economic policies are going to impact on China and also the rest of the world?
Well, I think we have to begin by recognizing there's a certain degree of uncertainty. I think they will have a negative effect on China, but also especially on the U.S. It means inflation will go up. And we have just had a difficult time the last 2 or 3 years trying to bring inflation down to a better level. And I think the risk is that it could start going back up for two reasons: the tariffs, and also he's promised big domestic tax cuts.
Do you have any recommendations for the Chinese government? I understand you have been studying Chinese economy almost for your whole career, right?
Well, I think China has made some preparations. They've changed some laws. They've started to put some restrictions on exports of certain products. And I think China has a lot of more leverage than most people in the United States would understand. I think there's a feeling that China will just be helpless. And I think the lesson from the tariffs that were imposed in the Trump first administration is that China adjusted fairly well, did not suffer a big loss. And I attribute that partly to the fact that most Chinese exports, in fact, almost all Chinese exports, are produced by domestic private companies or by foreign companies that are operating in China. And these firms tend to be fairly flexible and nimble. And when one market has some restrictions, they know where to go to find new markets. 世界并没有在跟中国脱钩。事实上，这疫情这3年，
我们的出口占世界的比例是上升的，而不是下降的。世界呢，其实更加依赖中国，而不是相反。另一方面，我们的企业是有转出去啊，但是我们看到它转出去的地方啊，是东盟一些国家、墨西哥这些国家。那我们的这个产品啊，是绕到这些国家，又出口到了欧美这些发达国家。所以最终呢，还是中国的企业在做。
One way for Chinese companies to circumvent the high tariffs is to move to other countries to produce, then from there export it to the United States. I mean, even Biden administration has realized this and also raised the tariff on some of those countries. Do you think that the Trump administration is going to chase Chinese companies to increase tariffs on every country with Chinese investment?
Well, that's a possibility, but I think the lesson of what we've seen is it's very difficult to do that because the companies are very nimble. They'll set up in one country. If that doesn't work, they can go to another country. So I don't think the U.S. ability to do that is perfect. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that even when the tariffs were put on in the first Trump administration, there was a system whereby American companies could apply for exemptions. So even if President Trump would have these very high tariffs, there would, I suspect, be a lot of exemptions. So the real average tariff rate would be somewhat less.
What kind of measures can China take to counter the impacts of the Trump tariffs, like a stimulus or structural change?
Well, I think there are several things they could do. One would be a larger stimulus program, either fiscal or monetary. And the other thing, of course, that could be done is to enter into negotiations. I mean, China does have some leverage. It controls many very important minerals and metals, especially rare earths. They're very small in quantity, but critical in a lot of applications.
Right. So it's going to have almost a revolution, not just for American economy, but probably also for the world economy.
I think they will have a negative effect on China, but also especially on the U.S.
What are the problems for the Chinese economy? So is it because of a lack of external demand, a lack of a reform, or something else? Many people are saying that the most serious problem for China is a lack of demand, particularly lack of consumption. Do you think this assessment is correct?
The evidence doesn't really support that view very strongly. Consumption share of GDP has been rising in the last few years, starting even before COVID. In 2023, for example, I think household consumption went up by around 9%, which was very high. And to me, the interesting thing was that household consumption was rising more rapidly than disposable income. So people would get a certain amount of income, pay some taxes, and they would spend more than that, which meant that they had to be reducing their savings rate. So I was questioning this widespread view that consumers lacked confidence because they were reducing their savings rate. And if you don't have confidence and you're worried about the future, your savings rate should go up. Instead, it seemed to be going down.
Given that, what are the problems for the Chinese economy? Because people will say, hey, look, the recovery has been quite sluggish. So was it because of a lack of external demand, or was it because, like many people say, lack of a reform, or something else?
Yes, China is growing more slowly than it used to. But most advanced economies are growing much, much more slowly than they used to. If you take 2019 as the base, that is pre-COVID,
Right.
now at the end of 2024, we'll have had 5 years.
Right.
In 5 years, growth, cumulative growth in Germany, zero. In France, zero. In the UK, zero. In Japan, zero. Now, the US has done better than that. I think cumulative US growth over that period is something in the neighborhood of 12%.
Okay.
But China's expanded by 25%. So the economy is a quarter bigger than it was just before COVID. China's growing much more rapidly than any other advanced industrial economy. There are still some structural problems that haven't been addressed. And China's also grappling with a correction in the property market. And since property has been a very large source of demand, a lot of investment demand from the property sector, that can't all be replaced immediately. Cumulatively, investment in property in China over the 3-year period, 22, 23, 24, is down about a third. And given the large share of investment that is going into property, it seems to me almost inevitable that growth has to slow down. But I do think also, as your question suggested, that if there was a resumption of more economic reform, that growth could increase over time.
The relative size of Chinese GDP to United States GDP, it reached the peak by 2022, 76%, right, in nominal terms. But over the last 2 years, it declined. I think this year probably it would decline to close to 60%, right? That's of course because the United States has higher inflation rates than China's, and also U.S. dollar has been appreciated against RMB. Also because of the slow recovery in Chinese economy, many people say, Chinese economy is peaking, right? It's reaching its growth limit. What's your take on that?
I think this idea of peak China is premature at best. But I've looked carefully at the data, and China has had very, very low inflation in this period, and inflation measured by what we call the GDP deflator. So it's some combination of consumer prices, producer prices.
Right.
It's trying to look at what the price level is for the whole economy. So the prices in China have only gone up less than 6% over the 3-year period.
Right.
And in the United States, it's over 15%. In the long run, I think China still has substantial potential for economic growth. Because if you look at China's level of per capita income and try to compare it in similar prices, or what economists call PPP, China's per capita income is still very far below that of the United States. It's about 25 or maybe at the most 30%.
Yeah.
And if you look at the other successful countries historically in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and so forth, they grew very rapidly until their per capita GDP measured this way got up to about 55, 60, 65%. So by that time, they had exhausted, you can borrow technology, and this is called convergence. So when you get up to 55, 65%, you have already taken advantage of this convergence. But China is still at, around 30% or a little bit less. So I think China still has significant potential for convergence. And these other countries that I just mentioned, they were growing at 7 or 8% until they hit this level of 55, 65%. So I think once the property adjustment or readjustment takes place, And maybe if there's a new reform initiative, I think China still has the potential to grow at 6-7% for another decade.
That's a really optimistic, encouraging. Right.
It's potential.
Potential.
It's not a forecast.
That's right.
But it will take the right policies.
我一直呢是对中国经济保有信心，在长期，我永远是一个乐观主义者。首先，第一点就是中国的技术进步速度啊，其实是超出我们一般人的想象。
Inside China, technological progress has been emphasized as one of the most important drivers for China's long-term growth. But there are also concerns about this potential conflict between technological progress and the internal demand. Do you see this conflict?
There may be a conflict in the short run, but in the long run, I don't think there is. I mean, every time new technologies have been introduced, I mean, go back a century or more in the United States when the automobile industry was getting started. Well, people thought this was going to lead to a lot of lost jobs. And it turned out, of course, to be exactly the opposite. The automobile industry flourished. It became a big source of wage growth and so contributed to a strong economy. And I think we probably see the same thing with the rise of the internet. And I hope we will see it also eventually with AI, that there's much potential for increasing productivity. Now, some people say a lot of people are going to lose their jobs because they'll be taken over by AI.
Right.
I think this is a fear every time new technology is introduced.
Exactly.
And it may be a factor in the short run, but in the medium and longer term, new technologies are a major, major source of economic growth.
Inside China, technological progress has been emphasized as one of the most important drivers for China's long-term growth.
I think this idea of peak China is premature.
What kind of headwinds China has to deal with in the time coming? There must be some headwinds in the future. So what kind of headwinds China has to deal with in the time coming?
Well, I think in the short run, it's adjusting to a lower level of property investment. And I think all of the properties that were pre-sold but haven't yet been delivered to the households that have paid for them or begun to pay for them, if those people don't get their houses or their flats, actually aren't able to move into them, then their confidence in the whole housing sector will not come back. So I think the government has made some priority that for the banks should be lending not to finance new developments, but to help projects that are partly finished or near finished. And I think that that's going to is already having some positive effect. So that's number one on the headwinds, but that's relatively short run. Medium term and longer, of course, is the declining size of the workforce that I mentioned earlier. And that's certainly a headwind we could talk about. The third headwind, I would say, is the geopolitical situation, the deterioration in U.S.-China relations, and the tendency towards, I'll use this word, but it's an exaggeration, a kind of deglobalization. I don't think it's going to be complete, but a lot of the growth of the global economy has been based more trade, more comparative advantage, countries producing things that they're more efficient in producing, specialization, we would call it. But now there's a kind of a little bit of a backlash towards that. And it is, of course, tied into the geopolitical situation. National security, everybody is moving more in the direction of self-sufficiency. So that's a headwind. It's not just for China, it's for everybody.
Yeah. Since you mentioned the deglobalization, do you believe that the last round of globalization has ended? Are we entering kind of fragmented world without any direction?
Well, that's a possibility, but I think it's too soon to say that that's where we're headed. A lot of people have talked about, de-risking or decoupling, but when you look closely at the data, there has been some of that, but there's still a lot of trade globally, even between China and the United States. The risk, quite frankly, is too many countries defining national security very, very broadly. Everything is national security, which means you try for more self-sufficiency, you have more protection to try to boost up your domestic companies. That's very unfortunate.
我觉得所有的领域都需要人才。因为国家呢调整专业，这是个动态的过程，它一直在调整。如果我们老去追逐这种所谓的热门专业，你想，你今天进大学的时候，你觉得这是个热门专业，但是所有的人都这么想。那这样的话呢，4年之后你毕业的时候，你突然发现呢，这个专业有太多的人了。反倒是4年之前你觉得冷门的专业，它变成了一个热门的、很好找工作的专业了。所以，如果问我的建议，我会告诉大家，选你热爱的专业还是最重要的。360行，行行出状元。
This is one of the headwinds that China faces, this aging process, as you say, super aging. China's aging is very, very rapid. The problem can be dealt with by the government in certain respects. One thing has already been done, and that is to increase the retirement age, providing incentives for individuals to work longer. And of course, that means they would be paying into the government's pension system and making that stronger. And the other thing is Generation Z should be encouraging the government to undertake policies that will improve productivity. When the population growth slows down and the working age group of people gets smaller, growth will slow down unless you have improvements in productivity.